But what's the old saying, Brian? It's the wrestling business, not the wrestling friends.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. You know, when people look back on Jim Crockett Promotions or Mid-South, it's easy for them to think, oh, everyone was best friends. They were on the road every single day they saw each other. We don't hear about these big locker room fights. I mean, every now and then is a story. But in reality, there were guys in those locker rooms that other guys didn't like, right?
Yes. And some had just hated each other. And if, you know, I mean, that's going to happen. And again, it's not all friends, the friends business, it's the wrestling business. And there were always guys that didn't like each other, or guys that if they'd had their secret wish, somebody across the room from them would have disappeared and burst a fucking flame. But and that's another thing you mentioned, that the guys were on the road every day and were, you know, together all the time. That's what caused a lot of that. Because a lot of those guys, they'd get mad, but then they'd have it out in some fashion. It'd be over with, because it was like people on your team that you're around too much and they're getting on your fucking nerves. It wasn't, you know, a life or death hatred conflict that we can never be friends and it will never be over. It was, oh, goddamn, I can't take the sound of that fucking guy's voice because I hear it more than my own wife's, because we're always together.
How many people hated Tully in the locker room in like 86, 87?
Nobody
hated him.
Tully,
okay.
And wanted Tully to die.
I didn't say that. I did not say that.
Well, hate is a strong word. There were a lot of people like, Tully's a fucking prick. Because Tully was a bit of a fucking, he was the high school quarterback. He was the son of the promoter, the wrestling star. He was, you know, he was a bit pricklish. And, you know, and if it hadn't been for Flair, a lot more people would have probably told Tully what a prick he was. But Flair liked him. And Arn and Tully. Arn was better friends with Bobby Eaton than he was with Tully Blanchard. If you're talking about outside the ring, just personal friends, hang out and drink a beer. They were more alike. But at the same time, Arn knew that, you know, Tully's his partner and Tully's a great talent. Tully has his strong points, but Tully also is abrasive. And so Arn would call, hey, Wombat, or hey, Eddie Munster, you know, on the plane. He'd give him a little jab, but it was all, you know, that's the thing. Those guys were so good at jousting with each other in a witty way that you couldn't get mad at because everybody else was laughing. And then you had to figure out a way to fucking zing them back. That diffused a lot of the just fuck you that might have come up, because you couldn't fucking get mad at a guy who's just blistered you verbally in an entertaining way, and now you want to fight him. Well, then you'd look bad. But a lot of it in those days, except if it was an issue that arose from a match or an angle where people thought the other guy was taking liberties or they were being ill treated or whatever, it was just from being around people. And that's why a lot of the baby faces had conflicts, because they were in the cars with each other together. Or the heels had conflicts because they didn't even have to wrestle. They were in the cars with each other together, or in the locker room with each other together. And there was just some abrasiveness, but it didn't last long and it didn't disrupt business. When I got to, and that's another thing, if two guys wanted to have a fight in those days, nobody was going to call the police. Nobody was going to sue anybody. The fans weren't going to ever find out about it. So they did. And whoever won was right. And that settled it. The other guy could stick around or leave the territory or whatever. But it wasn't this simmering, bubbling. The first time I ever saw the cliques and people taking sides and, you know, long-term animosity and people really trying to obviously cut each other's nuts off was in the WWF in, 93, 4, 5, 6, 7, that era. That's the first time I'd seen anything to that extent. It always happened, but it was isolated or it was here and there. But, you know, and I was shaking my head at that point, at that time, why Vince puts up with all this shit. But that was nothing compared to this, because these were, in that case, it was still major stars drawing money, experienced professionals, and knew what to fucking do in front of the camera. They just had problems behind the camera. And really only Brett and Sean bubbled over in front of the people. So, the old days, everybody's going, well, the fucking guys, they just fought like crazy in the old days. Well, no, you hear the stories, but when there was 25 territories running 7 nights a week for 40 fucking years, you're bound to end up with some fights. But in terms of not only frequency, but public embarrassment and fucking childish reasons to begin with over the whole thing, this little run over the past 8 weeks or so takes the cake, as far as I can recall.